The bank notice confirmed that my safe deposit box had been converted to joint access. His name appeared alongside mine. The change was active. The teller called minutes later to verify whether future correspondence should be addressed to both of us. She spoke as if the decision had already been discussed. She asked if we preferred duplicate keys or a single pickup. I went into the branch and asked for the change log. They printed it without hesitation. The request had been submitted electronically under my profile. It wasn't pending. It wasn't provisional. It showed acknowledgement and completion. I texted Noah from the lobby. He replied quickly and said he'd taken care of it because the box was tied to the estate inventory we talked about. He said the bank required clarity if something happened to me while we were traveling. He said it was just a safeguard. We had been seeing each other for 3 months. He was younger, attentive in a quiet way, good at showing up without noise. He'd helped me sort through my mother's things after she died, sitting on the floor with me, reading labels, asking where things belonged. He never rushed me. He waited for instruction. That afternoon, he met me at my place with coffee and the bank receipt folded neatly in his pocket. He said the banker explained it was simpler if one additional person had access in case of emergencies. He said my name was still primary. He said nothing had really changed. We spread the contents of the box on the dining table that night. Deeds, old jewelry, documents with my father's handwriting. Noah handled everything carefully, asked before touching, passed things back to me when I hesitated. When I couldn't bring myself to read one envelope, he slid it aside without comment. He suggested making a list of what was there so nothing got misplaced. He wrote as I talked. He didn't ask why certain items mattered more. He accepted it when I said they just did. The next day, the bank emailed asking him to confirm key preferences. He forwarded it to me with a note saying he'd let me decide. I told him to choose whatever was easiest. He picked up the spare key on his lunch break and left it on my counter. Over the following weeks, the arrangement settled into something ordinary. When I needed a document from my accountant, Noah offered to grab it since he was nearby. He returned it the same afternoon, placed exactly where I kept it. When I mentioned wanting to reorganize the box, he suggested doing it together so we'd both know where things were. He started keeping track of dates tied to the contents, renewal notices, appraisal windows. He reminded me when deadlines came up, framed it as help. I didn't correct him. One evening, he mentioned that the bank recommended consolidating related assets under the same access profile to avoid complications. He said it didn't mean transferring ownership. He said it just aligned records. He said we could undo it later if it felt wrong. The form came through my email after dinner. It was brief. I skimmed it while he washed dishes. It authorized him to handle inquiries and maintenance tied to the box. I signed without rereading. The confirmation stated that changes would require an in-branch request from both parties once processed. After that, the emails stopped coming to me directly. Notices arrived through him summarized. He said the bank preferred one point of contact. He said it reduced errors. When I logged into my account, the box details were still there. My name was still first. Nothing looked missing. I told myself that was what mattered. The system felt quieter, more contained. Someone else was holding the edges while I dealt with the center. I didn't go back to the branch to change it. That would have meant reopening something that was already set. By the end of the first week, the box had a rhythm. Noah stopped asking before going to the bank. He told me after. He'd swing by on his lunch break, check that everything was in order, make sure the seal numbers matched. He said it was easier when one person kept eyes on it consistently. When my accountant emailed asking for the original deed, Noah already had it scanned and ready. He forwarded it with a short note saying he'd saved a copy in case it was needed again. I didn't ask where. We grew closer in ways that didn't feel dramatic. He stayed over more often, not every night, but enough that his clothes occupied a drawer. He learned which mug I reached for without looking. When I woke early, he was already up, reading quietly so the light wouldn't bother me. One evening, after we'd gone through another stack of documents together, he mentioned that banks flagged accounts with inactive owners. He said it was common when assets sat untouched after an estate settled. He said activity kept things from being reviewed unnecessarily. He suggested we make a small adjustment. Nothing structural. Just updating contact preferences so notifications didn't bounce between departments. He said the banker had mentioned it when he picked up the spare key. The email came later that night. It wasn't framed as a change, more like a clarification. I approved it from my phone while he was in the shower. The confirmation thanked us for streamlining communications and noted that future correspondence would route through the designated contact. His email. After that, letters stopped arriving at my place. When something came up, Noah mentioned it in passing. An appraisal reminder. A compliance check. He spoke about them the way you talk about whether present, manageable, already moving on. I trusted him because he never dramatized it. He never said anything was urgent unless it was. When I asked to see a notice once, he handed me his phone without hesitation, scrolled to the message, let me read it. Said what he said it said. We hosted friends for dinner. Someone asked about my mother's jewelry, whether I decided what to do with it. Noah answered before I did, saying we were cataloging it carefully. He caught my eye after and smiled like he was checking that he'd said the right thing. Later that night, he apologized for speaking for me. He said he'd gotten used to being the one fielding questions. He said he'd defer next time. I told him it was fine. The bank sent a routine verification request the following week. It asked for confirmation that joint access was still accurate. Noah replied within the hour. I found out when he mentioned it over breakfast. He said they like prompt responses. He said it kept things from escalating into reviews. I didn't go into the portal to check. I hadn't needed to. Everything that mattered still seemed to be where it belonged. When I did log in briefly, the interface looked slightly different. Fewer prompts. Fewer alerts. The box details were still there, but under a tab labeled Managed Access. My name was still listed. Noah's was listed beneath it, bolded. I closed the page. That weekend, he suggested we move a few items out of the box and into safer storage at my place. He said banks discouraged frequent access during compliance cycles. He brought over a fireproof case and placed it in my closet without fanfare. We went through the items together. He handed each one to me first. I decided what stayed and what moved. He packed carefully, labeled everything in my handwriting because he said it mattered that way. That night, he held me while I fell asleep, his arm heavy and steady across my back. He said it felt good to be trusted. He said he took that seriously. I believed him. The system felt balanced. Shared. Nothing about it felt like loss. Changing it back would have meant interrupting something that was working. The shift showed up in places I hadn't been watching. I stopped seeing the bank's messages entirely. When I asked Noah about an appraisal notice I'd been expecting, he said it had come and gone. He said it was routine. He said he'd confirmed it and scheduled the next step so it wouldn't linger. He spoke the way you do when something has already been handled. At the branch, the teller greeted him by name and asked if he wanted the same room. She nodded to me politely, then turned back to him and asked if there were any changes to access preferences. He said no. He said everything was aligned. We sat across from each other at the small table. He slid a folder toward me and said the bank had updated its standards for jointly accessed boxes tied to estates. He said they preferred a consolidated custody record to reduce risk. He said it didn't move ownership. It clarified stewardship. The document was brief. It authorized managed custody for the box contents, with inventory maintained by the bank and access coordinated through the designated contact. My name appeared at the top. His appeared as coordinator. The language was neutral, tidy. He said it would reduce visits. He said it protected against loss. He said it could be reversed later if I wanted. I signed it there with the pen they provided. Once it was filed, undoing it would require a formal request and review by the bank's risk committee. After that, the cadence changed. The box was sealed for inventory. Noah handled the drop-off and confirmation. He sent me a photo of the receipt and said everything was logged. When I asked when we could access it again, he said the review window varied. He said the bank would notify him. At home, he organized the fireproof case we'd brought items into. He suggested adding a list to match the bank's inventory so nothing felt abstract. He typed as I spoke, reading back entries to confirm. When I hesitated over a ring, he asked if it should be listed or kept out. I told him to list it. He did. He stayed less. When he did come by, it was to update me. Short visits. Clean edges. He said the bank liked consistency and that too many hands raised flags. An email arrived from the bank addressed to him, with me copied faintly at the bottom. It confirmed managed custody activation and noted that inquiries would route through the coordinator during the review period. I read it once and archived it. A week later, my accountant asked for a document I knew was in the box. I told him I'd get back to him. When I mentioned it to Noah, he said he'd already provided a certified copy and saved it for future use. He said it was easier that way. The first real absence landed quietly. I went to the branch alone and asked to see the box. The teller checked the screen and said access was coordinated through the manager during custody review. She offered to message Noah to arrange it. I said I'd wait. She smiled and said reviews usually went faster when the coordinator handled requests. She asked if I wanted to leave a note. I left without one. At dinner that night, Noah said the bank had asked to extend the review to include related items that had been listed, but not yet transferred. He said it was procedural. He said it would keep things consistent. The addendum arrived on my phone while he cleared the table. It referenced the earlier authorization and expanded the scope to include off-site items associated with the inventory. It was framed as temporary. I signed. Once processed, the system confirmed that all listed items fell under managed custody until the review concluded. After that, the questions stopped reaching me. Decisions logged. Notices acknowledged. Dates set. Noah's tone flattened. Still kind. Still precise. Less intimate. He spoke in outcomes. When I asked when the review would end, he said the timeline was flexible. He said it depended on findings. He said it was better not to rush banks. He didn't stay that night. He texted later saying he needed to keep his schedule open in case the branch called. I lay awake and pictured the box sealed, numbered, carried by hands that weren't mine. The system had closed around it neatly, and it no longer needed me inside. The effects showed up in the small, ordinary places first. I learned the inventory had been completed when a revised statement appeared in my mailbox with no contents listed, only a reference number, and a note that assets were under managed custody. The line for inquiries pointed to the coordinator. Noah's email was there. Mine wasn't. When I asked him about it, he said the bank didn't itemize during review. He said it prevented discrepancies. He said once the process cleared, everything would be visible again. He stopped coming over casually. When he did, it was brief and purposeful. He brought updates, not conversation. He'd stand by the counter, mention that the branch had requested one more confirmation, or that the appraisal window had shifted. He didn't sit. He didn't stay. I tried to access the online portal again. The safe deposit section had been moved. A banner at the top read, "Managed custody active." There was a button to request information. It redirected to the coordinator. At the branch, the tone had changed. The teller spoke carefully, with the same polite distance you use with someone who isn't the decision maker. When I asked about timelines, she said reviews varied. She said the coordinator would know more. She said it was best to keep communication centralized. A letter arrived from the bank addressed to Noah, forwarded to me as an attachment. It confirmed that during managed custody, withdrawals or transfers required coordinator initiation. Owner presence alone was insufficient. The language was clean, unemotional. I asked Noah if that meant I couldn't retrieve items if I needed them. He said it was unlikely I'd need to. He said most people didn't access boxes during review. He said the bank discouraged exceptions. That week, my accountant followed up again about a document. I told him there was a delay. He asked if he should call the bank. I said no. I forwarded the request to Noah instead. He replied later that the copy had already been provided and that the accountant should have it. He didn't include me on the thread. The fireproof case in my closet began to feel different. The items inside were the ones that had been deemed unnecessary to inventory. I opened it once and saw the careful labels. The handwriting I recognized as mine. Felt like a remainder. Noah suggested adding the case to the managed list so everything would be accounted for. He framed it as protection. He said banks didn't like parallel storage during custody reviews. He said it raised questions. I said I'd think about it. The next day, a bank email arrived confirming an update to the inventory scope. It referenced off-site associated items. It thanked the coordinator for prompt confirmation. The attachment listed the fireproof case by description, not contents. Called Noah. He answered on the second ring. He said the bank had asked about it after reviewing the earlier addendum. He said it was better to include it than explain why it wasn't. He said it didn't mean immediate transfer. It just aligned records. I didn't argue. The update was already logged. After that, access tightened. When I tried to schedule an appointment at the branch, the system prompted me to coordinate through the manager. When I left a message, the response came back addressed to Noah with me copied. It suggested dates that worked for him. He stopped using my place as a midpoint. His things disappeared gradually. A sweater 1 week. Shoes the next. The drawer he'd used was empty without comment. The bank sent a satisfaction survey thanking us for cooperating during a high-sensitivity review. It asked whether we wished to continue managed custody after completion to reduce future risk. Closed it. When I asked Noah when the review would end, he said banks didn't like fixed dates. He said patience mattered. He said pushing made things look unstable. His voice was calm, distant, efficient. The last time he came over, he stood by the door and said the branch might need an additional confirmation if they expanded the review further. He said he'd handle it if it came up. He said it was better that way. He left without waiting for a reply. The system kept moving. Notices acknowledged. Scopes expanded. Access coordinated. Everything was still technically mine. It just wasn't reachable anymore. The compression came without drama. A courier envelope arrived from the bank addressed to Noah, forwarded to me as a scan. It confirmed an extension of managed custody due to related asset alignment. The scope now included any items previously associated with the box or its contents. The effective date was immediate. The contact listed was the coordinator. I called the branch and asked to speak to the manager. The receptionist said he was in meetings and that requests were queued through the coordinator to avoid duplication. She offered to note my call. I declined and hung up. That afternoon, my accountant emailed again. He needed a notarized copy of a document for a filing deadline. He asked if he should escalate. I forwarded the message to Noah with a short note. He replied hours later saying the bank had already provided what was required and that further requests could complicate the review. He said it was better to let it run. The fireproof case in my closet felt heavier than it had before. I opened it and saw the empty space where a bracelet had been. I checked the labels. The list still included it. I searched the drawer beneath. Nothing. I texted Noah and asked if he'd moved anything. He replied that during alignment, the bank sometimes requested pre-transfer of listed items to avoid discrepancies. He said it was logged. He said nothing was missing. The next email came from the bank confirming receipt of associated items for custody holding. It listed quantities, not names. The acknowledgement was addressed to the coordinator and thanked him for prompt delivery. I drove to the branch without an appointment. The security guard checked my ID and asked who I was meeting. I said I needed to retrieve personal property. He nodded and said retrievals required coordination. He offered to message Noah. I waited in the lobby. The screen cycled through rate updates. After 20 minutes, the guard returned and said the manager was unavailable. He said Noah had confirmed that retrieval requests would be handled after the review concluded. He handed me a printed note with a reference number. At home, I tried to initiate a formal request through the portal. The option redirected to a contact form that pre-filled Noah's email. My name appeared as owner, then disappeared when I tried to submit. Called Noah. He answered calm. He said showing up unannounced worried banks. He said it created records that were hard to unwind. He said the review was close and that patience mattered now more than ever. I asked when close was. He said timelines shifted. He said pressure extended them. That evening, a bank alert confirmed a pending action. Managed custody would convert to long-term holding unless the coordinator objected within a stated window. The window was short. The objection link went to Noah. I sent him a message asking him to object so we could end the review. He replied that objecting would trigger a secondary audit. He said it wasn't worth the risk. He said long-term holding reduced scrutiny. The following morning, a notice arrived confirming conversion. Long-term managed holding was active. Owner access required coordinator initiation. The language thanked us for cooperation. I went to the closet and closed the case. It felt ceremonial, like sealing something rather than storing it. Noah came by once that week. He stood near the door and said the bank had finalized things and that his role was essentially complete. He said he'd keep an eye on statements and let me know if anything needed attention. He said it was cleaner if one person stayed on it. I asked if that person could be me. He said changing it now would reopen files. He said banks remembered reversals. Later, a final notice arrived. It outlined ongoing fees for managed holding and listed the payment method on file. It wasn't mine. The authorization was attached. His name was there. The only remaining action available to me was to submit a formal dispute. The instructions said disputes were reviewed by a committee and required coordinator acknowledgement to proceed. The deadline for objections passed that night. Everything that could move had already moved. All that remained was a fixed arrangement, waiting to be lived with. The registered letter arrived signed for, not delivered. It confirmed that the contents under long-term managed holding had been consolidated into a custody account for risk mitigation. Owner access required coordinator initiation. The coordinator of record was Noah. The notice included a reference number and a storage location code. No inventory was attached. I went to the branch with the letter folded in my bag. The manager met me at the desk and listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded and said the file was clear. He said the arrangement was valid. He said retrieval requests could be submitted by the coordinator. He said my ownership was acknowledged. He printed a receipt for my visit and slid it across. It listed no next steps. Outside, I called Noah. The call rang once and stopped. That afternoon, a payment alert appeared in my banking app for managed holding fees. The payment method on file wasn't mine. The memo line included the custody reference number. It posted as completed. I opened the closet and pulled out the fireproof case. It was lighter than before. The foam insert showed empty outlines where items had rested. The labels were still there, my handwriting intact. I closed it and set it back on the shelf. A courier came before evening with a small envelope. Inside was a single spare key in a plastic sleeve. A note from the bank thanked the coordinator for returning unused access materials following consolidation. The receipt line listed 2 keys received. I had only ever held one. Noah's message came late, brief and precise. He said the bank had finalized the arrangement. He said staying involved any longer would create confusion. He said it was better if he stepped away completely now that things were settled. He said changing coordinators would reopen the file and risk additional scrutiny. There was no apology, no invitation to talk. The next morning, the portal updated. The safe deposit section was gone. In its place was a link labeled Custody Holdings. It opened to a page with a balance line and a note. Inquiries routed through coordinator. I drove to the branch one last time to close my accounts. The teller asked if I wanted to keep the custody relationship active. She said it simplified things. I said no. She said she'd note my preference. She printed a summary and wished me a good day. At home, I boxed the remaining papers from my mother's estate. The box felt heavier than the case ever had. I taped it shut and wrote the date on the top. When I stepped outside, the street looked unchanged. Cars passed. A neighbor waved. I stood there longer than necessary, then walked. Behind me, the holdings remained where they'd been moved, cataloged, consolidated, reachable by someone who wasn't there anymore. The key on my counter stayed where it was. It didn't fit anything.